Welcome to the Amphibian Press podcast. I'm V.S. Holmes, and with me today is Humphrey Hawksley, the thriller author of Man on Edge and Man on Ice, as well as many, many other titles. Thank you so much for joining me today, all the way from England.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and privilege to be on the show.
So tell me a little bit, for those of us who haven't gotten a chance to dive into your work yet, tell me a little bit about your newest release, which is Man on Edge, which I believe releases this week. Am I correct?
That's right. It actually released on March 3rd, so it was
awesome.
last week. I lose track where it was last week.
Okay.
And it's the second in a series, which I started a couple of years back with a book called Man on Ice. And that was set on the US-Russian border.
Okay.
The reason I said it there was because in my other life as a BBC foreign correspondent, I went there in 2015 when the Crimea-Ukraine crisis was happening, if you remember that.
Yeah.
And Russia annexed a bit of Ukraine into Crimea, and then it started and sponsored a civil war. And then the Malaysian Airlines jet was tragically shot down, and all of that stuff was happening. And here in Europe and in Britain, we were talking about the new Cold War, and all of that came up again. And this is where the border with Russia is. So this is where the jets are scrambled all the time and the troops are deployed. And we've got Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin, which is now, of course, a unified city and unified country, but you had the Berlin Wall there and all that kind of stuff. And I thought, okay, but there is a place where these two superpowers actually have a border.
Right.
And I thought, does anybody know about this border? Because I didn't, and I've traveled the world to all sorts of disasters and everything like that, and I didn't know about it much. So I opened an old atlas that I have sort of symbolically now in my study. And there is there's Alaska that juts out there, and then there's the end of Siberia, a place called Chukotka, and that's the Bering Strait. And there's about 55 miles between America and the mainland of Siberia, but right in the middle of that strait, there are two islands. One is American and the other one is Russian, and they're barely 2 miles apart. And on the American island, there's a native village of about 80 people. And they get up every morning and they look out, and they're looking out basically onto a Russian military base. This is where America and Russia meets, the meeting of the two superpowers. So I wrote Man on Ice about a thriller based in that area, obviously between Russia and America, stuff going on there. But the hero that I took him from that island. And in these native communities, in fact, we all know many projects, many communities anywhere around the world, there are huge problems of domestic violence, close-knit communities, alcoholism, all that sort of thing. And there's only a couple of ways to get out. One of them, of course, is to join the military, which is what my hero, Ray Kazena, did. And he broke through, he joined and broke through to officer class, was very skilled, very determined to make his way in the world and not be trapped into this community, which he loved, but he needed to get out. And he became the hero. And Man on Ice was a success, and I signed a second contract for Man on Edge, which was the one that came out last week. But I moved Ray Kazena and a couple of the other characters from Man on Ice, I moved them to the Norway-Russian border, on the other side of the Arctic. And again, it was, Russia, being very tricky. And up there in the Arctic, where the ice is melting and the sea routes are opening up, the key military piece of technology that everybody has to be ahead of is in submarine technology. The quieter your submarine, the stealthier it is underneath the ice, the more you control the waters. Those who control the waters control the world, as Sir Walter Raleigh said many hundreds of years ago. And so this is basically a chase story about getting some submarine technology secrets out of Russia before some big military exercises start, or some horrors can be unleashed upon the world. And again, it's Ray Kazena using his skills of the environment, using the way that if you're raised in a hostile environment, very much with the natural life there, not with Netflix and all the rest of it, then you sort of think and see things differently. And he took those skills and he used them with the Norwegians to sort of get the better of his Russian enemies. So that's Man on Edge, and it's actually come out to some quite lovely reviews, actually, which I've got to say, you know, as writers, you know, your audience is writer, you're a writer, and you're sitting there for months on end, wondering whether the sentence you've written or the story you're doing is any good. And you can't discuss it with anybody, can you?
No, I mean, you can share it with friends, but I feel like it's still like, you know, you run that risk of like, no, it's totally fine, it's great, and you're like,
Yeah,
is
they're
it
going
though?
to say exactly. I mean, one of the things I say, just interrupting myself for a moment, is that you know, you get this as well. I get people coming in and saying, you know, can you see my manuscript, or I'm writing a story, let me tell you about it, and all the rest of it. What piece of advice can you give me, if they actually ask that? And I say, the one piece of advice I give you is don't tell anybody about it or show anything to anybody until you're finished. And the first people you show it to, make sure they're not your best friends or your family.
Right.
Give it to a professional outsider
Mm-hmm.
and pay them a little bit of money for it, or swap a favor or something, because I'm sure you've known this. I have known, but you know, they give it to their best friends, and the best friend says what they think, and they're not best friends anymore very quickly.
Right. Yeah, I definitely feel that way. I remember hearing about, you know, writing your first draft in a vacuum, which obviously like isn't technically possible, but as close as we can get. And then once you've finished it to the best of your ability and you've put it away and now you're returning to it, that's when you can start to incorporate people's thoughts, people's opinions. Maybe, you know, you've read a new book recently that really did a good job at something that you're also trying to do in a similar way or in a different way, and you can then go in with all of this advice and all of these new thoughts, but to try and get the initial idea down without any of that interfering it's so hard.
Oh, it's and one of the most irritating elements is that, I mean, you have your genre, I have my genre. It's all
Right.
sort of basically storytelling and the flair that we have to that. So you're doing that, and I've done a geopolitical thriller about sort of the thing I just described with Man on Edge.
Mhm.
And your other things is, oh, you're doing that, are you? Why don't you do something like Harry Potter, because that sells really well? And you look at this person and you think, you have got no idea what it takes to construct and structure a story
Mhm.
or a narrative, and then to bring in the characters and bring in the reveals and bring in the mystery and bring in the action and make sure they're all paced properly.
Right.
It's a hugely intricate job. And then someone says, oh, well, I think I'm going to write a thriller when I retire from being an accountant. And I say, well, I think I'm going to be an accountant when I retire from being a thriller writer.
Well, I think it's interesting too, and I find this more common maybe with sort of the classic genre fiction, which is part of why I focus on it, is a lot of people do focus on those sensational titles, you know, like Hunger Games or Harry Potter. And I mean, those happen to be young adult examples, but you know, it happens everywhere. And not so much on the staples of the reading community, because like not everyone can write Harry Potter, and frankly not everyone wants to read something like Harry Potter. But the big names who have just been, you know, so consistent with their storytelling and consistent with their genre and their success and skill are those, you know, classic romance writers, classic thriller writers, classic old school sci-fi writers. And I think that there's something to that, and it's like this, like a staple food, you know, it's people don't necessarily praise it all the time, but you need it.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you, I mean, the great Clive Cussler, who died last week,
Yeah.
aged 88,
Hmm.
I grew up with him,
Right.
essentially, who created these wonderful adventures. And I think it's also a matter of sticking to what you do. If you think that it's there and it's working, it's got a readership, expand that readership.
Mhm.
I have a great friend who I won't name here, who was an incredibly successful historical romance writer and always hit the New York Times list. And this person wanted to write a thriller, uh, and the readership didn't go with her.
Right.
So she had to go back to what she had built her name and her readers on, and the thriller
Mhm.
did okay. But she could see that if she did that, then she'd lose the millions of readers she had with historical romance,
Right.
and get a fraction of those if she started on the thriller thing, which it takes years and years to grow.
Mhm.
I mean, if you look at somebody as successful as, say, Lee Child with Jack Reacher,
Right.
who's become, I mean, it must have been 10 years before he got the sort of traction that propelled Jack Reacher into being a global character.
Mhm.
And the other interesting thing about that, and I'm sure you get this as well as many of your listeners might, you do something and all everybody's interested in is, well, when's the movie going to be made? And well, if you look at if you go back and look at the Jack Reacher character again, that Lee Child created Jack Reacher into a globally recognized character without a single piece of celluloid being shot on him.
Right. Exactly.
And now that is happening and has happened, but it was the books and the reading of the books that created that.
Mhm. Well, and I also think that not every, I mean, filmmakers are incredibly talented, but not every story translates perfectly to film. And I mean, everyone always says like, "Oh, the book is better than the movie or whatever," and but also some movies are much better than the novelization that happens, maybe later. And I think because they're so different in format, that a lot of people sort of miss all of the stuff that has to go on but behind that. And it's like, well, maybe, some books need to stay books, and that doesn't mean that they're not good enough to become film. It just means that it's not a direct translation, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I always think that when they talk about the movie book comparison, I mean, you can't really compare it. I mean, is a is a Ford Chevrolet better than a jumbo jet?
Right.
It's not something that you could or is tennis a better game than football?
Right.
I mean, it doesn't actually, because if you look at the when you're looking at a movie, you've got thousands of different images and voices and movements coming at you all at once. When you're
Mhm.
looking at a book, you have your imagination and the words on the page.
Right. So because your work totally ticks like all of my little pet pet interests, so to speak. um, I'm fascinated by very isolated areas, and desolate landscapes, and all of the sort of extreme things that happen to the psyche when you're exposed to those things. My mom grew up on a very small island that ran off generator power during the winter. Well, all the time, but was very isolated during the winter. And so that,
In New England, or
yes, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
She
yeah,
she grew up
okay,
on Block Island, which is off of Rhode Island. Um,
okay.
and I think just like a couple years ago, they switched over from gas generators. But so that kind of thing just fascinates me. And were you able to, because obviously you've traveled the world, were you able to go visit those locations that you were writing about?
Yes, I
Awesome.
did. I think I would. I mean, getting to the Alaskan Island, excuse me, is called Little Diomede,
Hmm.
and getting there was an adventure in itself, because you fly to Anchorage and then to Nome, which is an old gold rush town
Hmm.
on the west coast there, and then you have to get a helicopter that only goes twice a week. So you basically have to charter your own helicopter,
Right.
and that lands you at the island. Now, the island is often clouded in fog.
Hmm.
And if that, so we got to Nome and we had to wait for 2 or 3 days before the helicopter could fly. Nome's not a huge place, so there were no hotel rooms and all the rest of it. It's a sort of, it really is, it's a one street town.
Mm-hmm.
And then we got out there, and there's no hotels, no cars on this island, nothing. So we slept on the floor of a school classroom. Luckily, it was the holiday time. I didn't know, and you have to bring your own food because there are no shops that sell food. I mean, there's a sort of store, but there's nothing there, and you had to cook your own food. And also, in order to go there, you have to get prior permission from the tribal council.
Right, of course.
And there are people that arrive and that thinking they could just go there because it's just like sort of going anywhere in the States, and they get bundled straight back onto the helicopter again.
Right.
But it was the most incredible. I was meant to be there. I had budgeted to be there for 36 hours, I think. So the helicopter flies in on a Monday and flies out on a Wednesday. I was there for more than a week.
Mm.
But I'm able to get to know the people that live there. And you have, on the one hand, you have a sort of modern English speaking, all the kids are there in their sort of t-shirts and funny hairdos, working the internet and playing games and all that sort of thing. And then the other, you've got the sort of the Eskimo. They call themselves Eskimos. Who have the Eskimo culture of going out hunting, picking vegetables, making your own food, being totally self-sufficient. And on the island there, as I said, there's about 80 people. There were a fair number of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans.
Okay.
So I drew all that together to create the character that I had. So I had a fairly good confidence that this is not a character plucked from my imagination. This is a composite character of the types of people that live on that island. And of course, the interesting thing is you'd know for your mother's island, your own background, is that if you grow up as an islander, then sort of moving into that big bustle of world, going from that island and then walking down Fifth Avenue or something, or going, working the big cities, it is a whole different sense of being aware of your environment.
You're right.
And where does the danger come from? How do I act in this situation? What are the, instead of expecting a storm to come in or a cloud cover to bring danger, what is going to bring danger to you on the New York subway? Right.
Well, because it's completely distinct. I mean, the two environments have almost nothing in common. So
it's apart from human beings.
Right, which that there might be the problem. Well, I think that's so fascinating because I work as an archaeologist, and we interact on a fairly regular basis with a lot of tribal people and tribal monitors, and in New England, which is where I work. We have a huge number of cities compared to anywhere near the Arctic Circle, and so when we see that relationship between sort of more traditional culture and more modern culture, it's much more blended, I think, and it manifests in a very different way. So I find that fascinating.
Blended in what way do you think?
Well, I think the divide between the generations, as far as people who focus on more traditional way of life, and then a more modern colonizer sort of way of life, is much less obvious because everyone is sort of interacting with this more modern world in this Western society, and I think it's maybe there's been more of a loss of culture because of that, but I also think a lot of that has to do with this is where colonizers first landed, so it's that interaction has been happening for a lot longer.
I find that fascinating because your archaeology would go back only so far compared to say what they find in Greece or Athens or something.
Exactly.
But I was in a conversation. This is slightly tangential, but it's attached to what we're talking about. Is a conversation. We have a county in Norfolk, in the east of England, which is pretty flat, and there are no motorways there, so you have to go through winding roads all the time. And I was talking to someone from there, and he said, "I said, why are the roads so winding? And he said, that's because the Romans never came here. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, a Roman road is a straight road,
Yes.
but an Anglo-Saxon road winds around all the villages.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, why is that? He said, because the Romans went in and colonized, and they just built the roads through whatever they did to get from A to B.
Right.
Whereas if you were an Anglo-Saxon trying to build a road, you'd get a complaint from this village and that village and all the rest of it. So,
Yeah.
and I do a lot of work as a journalist on this sort of one civilization coming into another, which you study obviously a lot too. So
Mm-hmm.
so one of the things is the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, where they're building all this infrastructure stuff around, and the Chinese are building motorways and airports and ports. They're opening 10 or 15 a day. Everybody loses cost, loses count of them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the colonizer, isn't it? The new civilizer going into a place that is not as strong and doesn't have the political government or management to actually get that sort of thing done.
Right. Well, and for me, what's really fascinating is my particular line of archaeology. We go in before they put in these new roads, these new pipelines, these new power lines.
Right.
So we're that in-between state, as this infrastructure is progressing, and we're sort of trying to find this middle ground between the tribes that might be impacted and then, the man, so to speak.
Yes. And how far do you go back? What sort of year dates are we talking about?
Well, it depends on the project. We'll go in and we'll see what was potentially in the area. So a lot of times we are working with Euro-American history as well. I've worked on 1600 forts and things like that. But we're sort of looking for whatever is possibly there, and we won't test places that aren't potentially culturally significant. So we're looking at landscape as well, and what the landscape used to look like, which is kind of cool. As rivers and things change. But my particular focus is on more Paleo-Indian technology and then bones and stuff, because my background's in bio.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Because is there still a sense of the land and the heritage and the belonging because I have a feeling the way our global politics is going, that this is becoming a much stronger element within it, so that the sense of place, the birthplace, particularly community place, the sort of idea that this is our land and it has almost some sort of spiritual attachment to us.
I think a lot of people do have that, and I don't know if maybe people who gravitate towards that type of thinking find themselves in archaeology or in environmental careers because of that. I'm not sure if it's a chicken or egg thing, but I know that whenever I'm working on a crew, and we do find ourselves in fairly remote areas, maybe not compared to Siberia, but
remote is remote.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked in upstate Maine, and that can get pretty rough. But I'll be out there with people, and there was one project where we were out there, and other than a few hunters and hikers, like people weren't there on the same scale. And my friend and I, we were just sitting on this shore of this river, and you can feel it. You can feel it. And I mean, obviously this isn't my land. I'm a white person. I'm descended from Dutch and Irish. This isn't my land in that aspect, but you can still feel it. And I know a lot of people I've worked with have said similar things. And especially when you reach a place, something that I sort of find fascinating, this is my own tangent, is when we first get on a site and you're looking at, wow, this is a beautiful view, this is just a stunning landscape. Thousands and thousands of years ago, the indigenous people probably stood on that same place and said, wow, this is a great vantage point. I can really see where the other tribe might be coming down the river, and I can see the swamp over there, and where the prey might be migrating through. And we're still standing there in awe and appreciating this place for different reasons. But it's still that connection. And whenever
That's
I've felt that feeling, usually there is a site there. Um, whether it's a
okay,
camp
yeah.
space or it's a burial, there's been something there. So I think there is that connection.
Fascinating. I mean, one of the reasons I sort of brought that up is that because I've done a lot of this stuff about divided places,
Right.
The Korean Peninsula, Ireland, all that sort of stuff. But in the Reykjavik, the Alaska Diomede thing, I mean, we got to remember that America bought Alaska off Russia. And therefore the people across the Bering Strait, they see themselves as the same people.
Right.
And when the Cold War, and after that happened, the Alaska Purchase happened, there was no real border was set up. So they kept going backwards and forwards as if nothing was there until the Cold War. And then what happened was the ice curtain came down. They call it the ice, like the Iron Curtain, the bamboo curtain. The ice curtain came down, and sort of overnight, families found themselves separated.
Right.
And that land on both sides of the border there is considered their land. So when I was on Little Diomede, and I said, and one of the interesting things about the border there is that there are no flags. There's nothing that says welcome to the United States. There are no customs posts. There's no markers. There's nothing in the water there. It's just, as you look at it, there's nothing to tell you that this is the border between two countries.
Right.
And I talked to one of the guys there, and one of the elders on the island, and I said, how come there are no flags? This is a border. There's usually flags. He says, we don't need flags. We know who we are. And I said, yes, so you're an upstanding American citizen. And he said, no. He said, I'm an Eskimo from the Bering Strait.
Right.
And all of us here are Eskimos. And another guy there said, and this might resonate, I was wondering on some of the sort of sites you get it. And I had a similar conversation with an even older guy there. And he says, I'm an Eskimo. He says, you never know, the Japanese might buy this place next and they'll want me to call myself a Japanese, but I'm not a Japanese. Right. I'm a native. Is that a strong feeling sort of that you come across?
I mean, yes, definitely. Honestly, it depends on the person I talk to, because I've worked with, tribal people who have totally embraced a more modern way of thinking of, and he's like, no, I'm an American. I'm as American as you are, probably more so. But I think because the history of our region is a little bit less mercurial, because while the East Coast, did change hands a few times, it was far less recent. And so sort of that integration is much older. And I think, especially as things change politically, there has been a bit more pushback of like, no, I'm an American, you're not. You're Euro-American, and which is true. And
you're a Euro-American, are you?
Yeah. But it's a strange phrase, right? And it's kind of interesting. And I think it's sort of interesting to see how the way we phrase things too changes the way we look at stuff. I remember reading somewhere that this teacher was starting to say, instead of, what is now the United States, for example, saying what is currently the United States, because it reframes it in your head. And I'm sure you've encountered the way language changes with politics. It might not be the United States forever. And just sort of reminding people of that is, I think, kind of important, because it sort of brings back that, well, tomorrow I might be Japanese, but I won't be Japanese, kind of thing.
Well, I found that I had a very interesting tour. I did the music tour around Nashville and Tupelo, where Elvis Presley was born, and Memphis and all that. And one evening bumped into one of those reconstructions of the Civil War that they have, the people in
Right.
uniforms doing it on the battlefields. And the guys that were doing it from the South were staying in our Holiday Inn hotel,
Hmm.
which have quite small lobbies. So I struck up a conversation with them. And it was about the time, I think, that ISIS had just risen up again and was threatening Baghdad in Iraq. So it was all over the TV screens. And I said, what do you think about this Iraq thing? It keeps going on, just opening a conversation, as it were.
Hmm.
And he said to me, he said, well, that's just what the Yankees do. And I didn't quite understand what he was talking about, being English. And
Right.
I said, what do you mean? He said, well, they go into other people's countries and they say that there's a high moral cause like democracy or something, and they just want the oil and they want to tax them and they want to raid their homes.
Yeah.
And he says, that's what they do down here and they're still doing it. Then the penny dropped. And here we were in, I can't, Tennessee or somewhere like that. And there was still this mindset
Hmm.
that they should be an independent nation.
Yeah, we see a lot of sort of dialogue around that and sort of the roots of it,
Oh,
whether,
really? Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
whether it's based purely in racism or if there is sort of a more economic background. And, I think like most political things, it is both very simple and very complicated. Um,
Yes, it's a very good way of putting it. It's an excellent way of putting it. Yes.
um, and I mean, it's a huge dialogue. And of course, like as a white Northern person, I think my place is more to listen than it is
Right.
to discuss. But it is very fascinating, and I think um, it really shows, especially in such a short time frame, right? Because the U.S. As we know it is incredibly young, and so seeing how not just the events but also our recounting of them can change so drastically in such a short amount of time, I think is really sort of
You mean
as much of the story.
history written by the victors, you mean?
Right. Well,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And then also how conversation around it can change. And
Mm.
I took a military history course when I was in college, and it was one of the best
Okay.
courses I could have possibly taken. I just found it incredibly fascinating, and it was all modern war. Um,
Right.
and I
Which is
it was just yeah, this is a totally different animal, right?
and of course the because I'm working on the third in this series now,
Hmm.
and looking, and of course, when you do a book, is you're writing it now, but it's not really going to come out for 18 months or a year or something after you put it in.
Hmm.
and and I'm looking at all the different types of it's more than warfare, because warfare has merged into something. So
Hmm.
you had the sort of military missile strikes and all that sort of stuff that is the stuff. The infantry is more out of the way. And then you had this, or you still have this idea of cyber attacks.
Right.
But that seems to have gone on now to this interfering in elections.
Right. Yeah.
And I've been looking into stuff called neuromarketing and all of this kind of digital manipulation
Hmm.
element, whereby you can win power or put your government in simply by manipulating how the voters are voting.
Right.
And I was talking to somebody at the UN yesterday about it, actually, and I said, well, is this cybercrime? What is it? And they said, well, it's a mix of
Hmm.
everything, but you actually have this bundle of, and it'll get a name at some stage, sort of non-violent warfare or something
Right.
like that, which is going to be equally potent
Hmm.
as a sort of military mechanism.
Well,
Um,
it's almost
sorry,
like
yeah,
propaganda in some ways. And I mean, I think all things on the internet, it's exactly like the outside world, just sort of extrapolated out in
yeah,
some ways. But it's well, what I'm fascinated about is how actual warfare, and by that I mean, violence and fighting, um, has become incredibly impersonal, um, while
yes.
the more direct attacks like the cyber warfare, so to speak, or whatever we want to call it, um,
Mm,
has become incredibly personal.
Yes. So what you're saying is that the drone strike is actually carried out by somebody sitting in a place in Nevada or
Right.
something,
Hmm.
and therefore doesn't smell the blood and the explosion and hear
Right.
the cries of those people that bullet
Hmm.
is hitting, as it were.
Right.
Uh, Whereby the cyber is it is sort of undeveloped at the moment, but I know that there's a lot of or there is growing pressure for there to be a kind of treaty within the UN sanctioned treaty on cyber.
Hmm.
Because if you examine how far it can go and how much it can disrupt all our lives, you're actually looking at a weapon of mass destruction.
Right. Right. And
Uh,
and you can see the fallout in a different way. Like,
yeah,
when people are attacked online, or if their identities are stolen or whatever,
yeah,
um, you watch the fallout in real time. And I think in a lot of ways, when there are actual people behind it, as opposed to algorithms, it's
yes,
it's a very voyeuristic thing to watch, someone whose life you just, infiltrated, so to speak.
yeah.
You're watching that disintegrate, um, which is a horrifying thought. But, in some ways, it's almost like they switched.
Yes, it is.
Mm.
It's and it's not. I think they've. They're talking about. I think if Trump just tore up a nuclear weapons treaty, didn't he, the other day?
Yeah.
But he's sort of tearing up something that nobody's thinking about anymore. So, or they're thinking about it. But I mean, but when you look at the because one of my topics is the rise of China. I do non-fiction books on that. I've just done one called Asian Waters, but I was looking at the Chinese building their military bases in the South China Sea,
Hmm.
whereby they, over the course of about 3 or 4 years, they constructed 5 fully fledged military bases in international waters. Nobody, or the US certainly, did not, do anything to stop them
Right.
in military terms.
Hmm.
There was no blockade, there was no warning shots, there was nothing that stopped China essentially taking control of one of the world's biggest. And I was talking to someone at the Naval Defense College, Naval War College up on Rhode Island, actually, that
Hmm.
about it. And there's a lot of debate going on because what China's actually doing there is it's changing the rules of the rules of engagement that embedded in something like the Geneva Convention
Right.
is when do you actually fire that shot in anger?
Hmm.
I mean, are you going to fire the shot against an engineer, an
Right.
unarmed engineer, against a Chinese fishing trawler that is doing something but actually isn't a naval vessel?
Hmm.
So these are the sort of military questions that people are clawing at and trying to get answers from at the moment.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. So, sort of to circle back to the fiction aspect,
Oh, we
obviously.
have tangented
I
way
know.
off that, haven't we?
No, it's awesome. That's what, like, I say, the tangents are always the best parts. Um, so obviously you have an incredible amount of experience, and you've seen and, interacted with sort of these people and places that a lot of us never see, except for maybe on the nightly news. But even then, we don't see it in the way that you have. So what do you see, that other fiction writers, or just sort of the general politics, what do you see as people getting wrong the most, um, when it comes to world politics or even geopolitical thrillers that other people who might not have the same experience, right?
um, I think I was having a conversation with some publishers at a book launch
Hmm.
recently, and we were looking at at the sort of cycles that thrillers or sort of popular stuff goes in, and we actually track back to the Da Vinci Code. Do you remember that,
Yes.
the thing, which I think came out 2009 or something like that,
Yeah.
and and we thought that had a that, and then that fired a lot of the religious thrillers, historical thrillers, and that went up, and it's still popular, but then it got taken over by the domestic psychological thriller with the unreliable narrator in Gone Girl, and then Girl on a Train, which is what, about 6-7 years old or something like that.
Yeah.
And then because of my own vested interest, I thought, what would we have to do, or what has to be done to make that old style sort of political international adventure thriller come to the fore like that? And it was one of those inconclusive discussions, because there were a number of people in the room who didn't want it to come to the fore because they were involved in the domestic psychological thriller. Right. But actually, what we've focused on is that when you have the domestic psychological thriller, you're still dealing with the same elements that you are really with the international political thriller, except instead of having a sort of domestic violence within the house, you're having geopolitical violence between nations. Right. So the envy and the hatred and the jealousy and the love and the craving and the purposefulness and the apathy and all of those human things actually can be transferred to governments. And then within that, you can put your real human characters who are tackling those things. But I think, to answer your question more directly there, what do I think that politics has got wrong? Well, I think, sorry, yes?
No, go for it.
No, I was just going to say, I think that what we're realizing is that the human character hasn't changed with the politics over the millennia. And when I was a young reporter, the Berlin Wall came down, and the academic, I think Francis Fukuyama, said, this is the end of history. Now every country is going to be democratic like us. And, you know, bit by bit, it sort of fell away with Iraq and Afghanistan, and then the Arab Spring that went nowhere and all the rest of it. And we realized that's not the case. And now we have the rise of China and the rise of Russia. And we in the West, what are we, Euro-Americans?
Yes.
Us Euro-Americans have been caught on the back foot by it. And I think that possibly that's not what hasn't yet been captured in the thriller writing. The point of view that's coming out of Russia or China or Hungary, which is, you've got this thing called a liberal democracy. And whether it's, as you said something quite beautiful the other day, it's very simple but very complicated, whether actually it's too complicated to put into a thriller. Right. You know, whether the person that picks it up at the airport is going to want that level of complexity in what they think is going to be a sort of hard, straightforward, good guy, bad guy action thriller. Well,
it's hard too, I think, when so much is going on, and we're more aware of it now because of globalization and the internet than we sort of ever have been before. I think it's sort of, do you want to show people a roadmap out of where we are now, or do you want to give them an escape, you know? And I think both are valid, right? You know, both are really important, but it's sort of where you want to take your reader.
Why do they pick up the book? Do they want to pick up a book, in my type of book, because of, you know, which is basically an adventure story, to get an escape or to find out more about what they're reading in the newspapers?
Or themselves.
Or themselves, yes. You know, these are the things that you know, tens of millions are spent on in focus groups to find out,
and we still don't know.
And we still got no idea. And actually, when I think of there's stuff that happens, I think the Arab Spring, Iraq, and all that, and often I give talks about all this and the rise of China and all that sort of thing. And I say, look, what I never get is that in all the think tanks and all the universities and all the debates and all the chat shows and all that sort of stuff that's going on in the background of it, why are we always missing the trick? And it began in my sort of career with the fall of the Berlin Wall that nobody had predicted. Right. Yet there were all those think tanks having these debates and discussions and writing their papers with their subclauses and footnotes. And then suddenly, you don't get it. And as I think, the South China Sea thing, the Arab Spring, the Iraq thing. Why did we think that we could go into a country and suddenly this panoply of great institutions would come down with a fair police force and an uncorrupt judiciary and a post service that worked and all the rest of it, and a prime minister that would be basically honest, propped up by a sort of strong administration. How did we ever think that could ever happen?
Right.
When both in Europe and in the US, it has taken a huge amount of bloodshed and thought and education and everything to even get to where we are now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in a lot of ways it sort of goes back to that interaction you had on the island where, you know, that elder was saying, oh, well, we're not American, you know, and if the Japanese bought us, we wouldn't be Japanese. It's sort of a lot of those decisions, especially with the like, oh, well, everyone's going to be Democratic now, you know, doesn't take into consideration the history of the people who are in that location. And something that I look at a lot is how the landscape has shaped those people and their culture for millennia, you know, so much longer than any kingdom or nation has ever lasted. And you can't make decisions about a people without taking that into consideration, and even then you might get it wrong.
Yeah, and you're talking about the basic sort of the rivers and the mountains and the coastlines and all that sort of stuff, that landscape that they have to live with that molds their character.
Right, exactly. Where there aren't boundaries, you know, like borders aren't actual things, you know, they just exist in our heads. They're not real.
Exactly. And what governments have done is, you know, what Britain did is that we just went and drew lines through tribal communities and all the rest of it, and thought it would work.
Right. And spoiler alert, it didn't.
Spoiler alert.
So tell us a little bit about where people can find you and where they can pick up your books now that they're very intrigued, if they don't want an escape.
Yes, thank you. They have my website is humphreyhawksley.com. That's HUMPHREY HAWKSL for London EY.com. And within that, there are direct lines to the two books. So Man on Edge is manonedge.co.uk, and Man on Ice is manonice.co.uk. And that goes straight to there. And there are the buying buttons there. And Amazon is, the easiest one. So there's a US buying button and a UK one. But I do say that if you're in a community, in a town, and you've got an independent bookshop, go into the bookshop and order it, or they might have it, but if they don't, they'll get it in a day or two, and that keeps those independent bookshops alive.
Always support local.
You always support the local bookshops because, they're closing hand over fist. They're finding it difficult, and I support I buy off Amazon, but when I've got a local bookshop on the coast in England, and I just sort of breathe beautifully when I see that it's full of people buying books there.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for talking with me, and I'll be sure to put all those links down below so people can easily find you. And,
brilliant. And thanks for such a fascinating conversation.
No, you too. I'm always amazed at like the stuff that I never think that we're going to talk about, because I have my little plan, but then it usually just gets completely thrown out the window in a wonderful way. And
well, that was great. What didn't we talk about?
I know, right?
I'm gonna check out a bit of that New England archaeology now, straight after finishing this.
Well, what's sort of fascinating, and I was just telling my mom this, is I've noticed that I'll have a conversation out in the real world with someone, and then a few days later my podcast guest will have some connection to that conversation, and it's bizarre. And my mom was just talking to me about slave-free chocolate, and then I was on your site, and I'm like, oh my god.
we didn't get that.
We didn't. No, I had it written down, but we touched pretty much everything else. So that's the one thing we didn't talk about.
Yeah, that was my great campaign that's still going. There's somebody, one of my former colleagues, he's just done a huge expose in Guatemala on it. And that was on coffee. Coffee. So we did the chocolate, sugar cane, all of those child labor supply lines. became very depressing after a time
Right, of
because,
course.
the interest was limited and you weren't getting anywhere against big corporations. But there we
Right.
go.
Well, I'll have to show her your site and let her go
Do
down
that.
that rabbit hole. She has a journalist mind. She
Ah,
worked as an editor for a very long time, so
oh, brilliant.
she
Yeah.
likes a good story.
Well,
So I'll send her
that's it.
down.
Well, if she Googles, I think it's Guatemala coffee child slavery or child labor, she'll get up the documentary that came out last week on it.
Oh, okay, awesome. Yeah,
Yeah,
she
yeah,
might have already found that because
yeah.
she was up like all night doing the research. So
Brilliant.
yeah.
Oh, lovely. Well, thanks so much, and best of luck.
Yeah, thank you. This has been the Amphibian Press podcast. I'm V.S. Holmes, and with me today was Humphrey Hawksley, BBC consultant and thriller writer. Thank you so much for listening.